Hey guys, what is up? It is me, Pagey, here once again with another video on DC films, well, DC animated films, whichever way you want to put it, because we're going to be reviewing part 3 of the Crisis on Infinite Earths movie event. Of course, part 1 released towards the beginning of the year, part 2 was around April, I think it was. I think it was around April, towards the end of April, maybe early May, and part 3 is released over the past couple days. Not too sure when this video is going to go up. Now, of course, minor spoiler warning, I'm not going to spoil everything. I'm not going to really talk in detail and break it down just because it's too long of a thing. We'd be here for like an hour, I think, if I was going to talk about all the specific stuff that happens in this film. But we will talk about specifics parts, so I guess like minor spoiler warning, but I'm not going to spoil how specific things happen, if that makes sense. But of course, throughout the video, be sure to let me know in the comment section down below your various thoughts on this. Have you watched the film? What do you think of it? All that stuff. Were you happy with it? Disappointed with it? I'm always curious to read what you guys are thinking. And of course, go on to enjoy the video, drop a like, takes 2 seconds. Now to recap before we get into this third part is part 1 I thought was really good. You know, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't 10 out of 10, but I think I gave it like an 8, 8.5 or something off the top of my head. I'm just going off the top of my head, so I can't specifically remember what I would rate it, though I don't normally rate things anyway. But it was I was actually sort of like pleasantly surprised because, the animated movies of DC, especially as of recent in this like Tomorrowverse, if you want to call it, which I think they actually do call the Tomorrowverse, which I think is a weird name. But anyway, they've been very inconsistent with some decent ones and then some bad ones. I don't think they've ever really nailed it with any of their movies, and that's why I was hesitant. I think actually probably Crisis Part 1 was probably their best one, or at least like top 3 at the very least, in my opinion, at the very least. So that started off a really good platform for this 3-part movie event. Part 2, however, was a bit disappointing. I think it was very stretched out. It felt like it was just trying to set up everything, I guess, for part 3, but in like a very elongated way. And that set up part 3 for me in a way, and where I was like, okay, it's either going to be pretty good, maybe not as good as part 1, but pretty good, because part 2 was a bit disappointing, and maybe they just did all the setup work. Or part 3 would maybe continue the trend and not be that great. To be honest, I think part 3 is a bit disappointing. If I'm just going to do a bit of a quick review here before we jump into specifics, I think part 3 is nowhere near as good as part 1, but I think it's better than part 2. But at the same time, it just feels really drawn out. It feels like this could have been just a 2-parter. And if you really look at it, like a lot of animated movies sometimes do the 2-parters. Like, I mean, with Watchmen, which comes out fairly soon, they're doing a 2-parter there. And I feel like that would have served a better purpose for this. The only reason I think they could, like, splitting up into 3 parts, I guess, makes sense outside of the time restraints, because, like, I feel like they drew stuff out anyway. It was just sort of to split it into arcs, if you want to put it like. So I was a bit disappointed with part 3 just because it just felt drawn out. Like, we wasted a lot of time. Well, I say wasted, but I feel like it was unnecessary, some of the stuff we were doing. Like, we spent like 5 or 10 minutes doing all this when I was like, is it really needed for the story? And the answer is no. It was pretty much so we could maybe meet a character or whatever it might be. But essentially, we pick up part 3 where part 2 ended. Part 2 is literally a cliffhanger, and part 3 picks up with the heroes versus the Anti-Monitor, and of course following on from Supergirl attacking the Monitor, and he pretty much brings up his failsafe, which sends all the remaining Earths that haven't been destroyed as of yet into the bleed, which I still haven't looked at it now. I'm just going off the top of my head, which I usually like to do when talking about like adaptations and stuff like that. I don't think it's the bleed in the comics from memory. I think they just use that for the movie, which I'm fine with. It's just another thing between realities, or a thing that exists outside the multiverse. That's a safe haven, or at least a part-time safe haven for a bit for our characters. But one downside when you're obviously outside of the multiverse is in this bleed area is that time and space is like constantly in flux. So we're seeing some interesting things where, like, we go to, I think it's Earth 1, and there's like a dinosaur attack, and then followed by that we see some World War II troops, and we get a bit of a cameo here, which is something that was in animation of recent, like a couple of years ago, but it's one of those like short DC showcase things, and we do see the Losers show up. Of course, you might have heard of the Losers before because there was a movie, what was it early 2010s or late 2000s, that had like Chris Evans, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, was Zoe Saldana in that? I can't remember, but that's like a DC property, but this is like set in World War II, I guess, and that one was set in modern day. But the Losers is a DC group, and they do show up briefly in this, which isn't really a spoiler because I don't think anyone really cares, Now, some of my, like, individual, like, oh, this is pretty fun moments, is that we did have like Nazis using the Batman rogue gadgets, which I thought was fun. But at the same time, those things were like, you know, you had the dinosaur attack, and then like the losers show up, and then like the Nazis using the rogue weapons. I felt like that ate up the time. Like it was interesting to see, but at the same time, I don't think it helped in regards to the flow of it, because then we're pretty much having all these action things. It's like, oh, you have the Nazis doing this, we have the Earth One dinosaurs and everything like that, and then we just go into a very repetitive state where it's just the heroes on the Monitor's space station or like his satellite ship just repeating stuff. So it's like, oh, let's try and save this Earth. Oh, we can't do it. Oh, we got to stop the Monitor from doing this. We can't do it. He destroys an Earth. We get a cameo. It just felt very repetitive through that. And I think it would have been fine if it was like slightly repetitive, but in a quicker fashion if this was only 2 parts. I feel like a lot of the complaints with the people, I know there's going to be complaints in regards to how they, you know, I guess tribute certain characters or how we farewell certain characters in this animated, you know, multiverse. But at the same time, like, my biggest issues are always going to be pacing. And with part 1, I was really happy with it. There was like some slow parts because they're just sort of, you know, setting some stuff up and planting some seeds. But it was like minor. I don't think it was like a lot to take away from it. But in parts 2 and 3, it just felt like it was very drawn out. I feel like you could literally put all the events of part 2 and 3 into this one part that we had here, which was an hour and a half. I'm not too sure if, I think this might have been the longest part. It felt very long watching it. Like, I checked the how long was left, because I thought, oh my god, I feel like I've watched an entire movie now. I'm only like 50 minutes in. And I was like, god, there's like another pretty much 50 or 45 minutes or something left to go. So that's definitely a negative, is just regards like it being drawn out, but it connects back to some of the issues with part 2. One of the other things is that I think one of the producers had said it, or it might have been the director or something. It said that you can go into this movie without really watching any of the other previous movies in this Tomorrowverse, which I think is the case pretty much for part 1 and pretty much all of part 2. But in this third part, it really does connect back to, I don't think you have to watch it, but it's the Justice League Warworld, or whatever it was called, which I hadn't watched because it got horrible reviews, and it ends up being like a very important part for this third part. And I was like, oh my god, that's like the worst thing possible. Is arguably the worst rated or reviewed movie in this Tomorrowverse becomes I don't want to say crucial, but a very important part to the plot, where I was confused. Like, they show a flashback to a moment from that movie, and I was like, is this new? And then I didn't know. I was confused. I was like legitimately like, wait, what's going on here? So I think that was a bad choice. But obviously they've put that in Warworld to then play out into this, so I guess they put themselves into a corner, and maybe they didn't realize people weren't going to like that movie very much. But I didn't watch that because it got such bad reviews. I'm not going to waste my time on a movie that seems to be like, you know, easily, or like for the most part, like disliked by fans. So I wasn't going to touch it, and it ends up being like a fairly, I don't want to say very, as I said before, but like a fairly important part, or at least a bit where if you don't know you haven't watched it, you're just a bit confused. And I was confused in regards to where characters were showing up, who certain characters were, because when a character shows, I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's who I think it is, but I had to wait 5 minutes until someone addressed him by his name, because he doesn't look like his comic book counterpart. But I was like, I'm pretty sure that's that character. Now, one character I did like how they used him in this final part was Dr. Fate. Of course, he was in parts 1 and 2, you know, sporadically here or there. But he does some cool stuff where, like, without spoiling specifically why it's done or where it happens and what it reveals, but he uses his powers essentially to supercharge Batman's detective skills and him tracking stuff and following stuff, which I thought was really cool. And just that whole sequence I found fairly interesting, and it leads to a question that people would have had for years, like what happened after this moment. Actually, I'll just say it, because we all knew it was going to happen in this third part anyway. There's going to be some answers around it. It revolves around the end of the previous universe, with like the Flashpoint universe and, you know, all those. So obviously the end of Apocalypse War, and where the Flash goes after that, and what specifically happens, and what leads to this new multiverse. And in regards to how they explain it and differ it, and, you know, they had their own take on it, which I thought was interesting, though I feel like it was like they just quickly explained and then just moved on. It was just them just trying to give this quick explainer. I feel like them doing that explainer might have worked better earlier, maybe in part 2 or something. I mean, like the final bit of part 2 before we stepped into this third part. But I think it was just their own take, and I thought it was fairly interesting, though it seemed to be like quickly forgotten in the actual movie once they explained it. And my only other like sort of like, I don't think it's a major criticism. It's just something that I noticed, and it probably falls into the pacing side of things. Is that especially in like part two, for example, Supergirl's a pretty important part of that story, and finding out what happened to her and why she led to here. And then she does like a pretty important thing in part three, and I don't think there's a lot of build up to it. I feel like it's almost like it's like, oh, we did the build up in part two, but it's like we've spent 3 months or something away from this thing. Like, obviously, if you watch it on a binge or something, like all three parts back to back to back, it'll probably work better, which would make sense. And obviously on the writing side of things would have made more sense. But in the actual viewing experience, when you're just watching part three after part two has come out months ago, I don't think what happens with her really works that well, just because of the pacing side of things. But as I said, on a binge, I would expect it to work like much better. Like, I actually know it would work much better. It's just that in this third part, as an individual thing, watching it as it comes out after watching part two when it came out months ago, it just feels a bit rushed. Like, there's no proper setup. Now, the one thing that I know I've actually seen, I saw it on Twitter like just before I watched it. I didn't get any spoilers, funnily enough, outside of these minor cameos, or I expected them. People weren't happy with how they handled certain things. So obviously the multiverse is being destroyed. You expect to see certain Earths get destroyed, and there is like cameos in regards to either just like quick shots or like actually like proper extended scenes of previous animated universe. Now, of course, Super Friends were in the trailer for this, and they pretty much are just what you see in the trailer is what you get in the thing. There's no voice because that's from like ages ago, that cartoon. But then, of course, we do get the Batman the Animated Series, which has Kevin Conroy in his last or final Batman performance before he unfortunately passed away earlier this year, I think it was. Which was good. It's obviously Kevin Conroy doing it, and there's some decent dialogue there in regards to that as well. But people just weren't happy in regards to, like, it just felt like they just put them in there to get rid of them. But I think it was almost like, I found it like it's almost them just like giving a nod to it. Like, in regards to what happens in this film, I think people would have complained either way. People complained that the Earths were destroyed, I guess. But then I think they would have complained if they didn't show up either. So I don't know where the win is there for the people that made the film. I have issues with this film, but like, I think you got to be fair at the same time. Like, I think that's a lose-lose situation for them in regards to whether they include them or don't include them. People probably would have complained regardless. So I was fine with that. They also do quickly show the Teen Titans Earth, but you don't see the Teen Titans, which I was a bit disappointed with. I was like, why? And I thought maybe it's because the animation style was a bit different, so they just showed the Earth. You can clearly tell it's the Teen Titans, like Teen Titans, that one. I think it was that one. I don't think it was Teen Titans Go. I'm pretty sure it was the early 2000s one. I think it was, because I think the Earth's like 03 or 203, or it might have been like 2003. I don't know. It was something like that, I'm pretty sure. But in regards to the actual like culminate, or the ending of it, and how they resort, like leading from Crisis into what's going forward, I have seen a lot of theories in regards to if it's in collaboration with James Gunn, and I think we have to wait and see. We have to wait and see whether there's any more DC animated movies in particular. Like, obviously there's shows, like obviously we have Creature Commandos, which is in James Gunn's DC universe, but there could be some other DC animated shows. But I think we have to wait. Like, if there's no announcements for any more DC animated movies, of course we have Watchmen coming out soon, which is a 2-parter, and there's some other like Elseworlds thing, like the Aztec Batman, and like this Batman Ninja 2. But there's a lot of theories that this is meant to be like almost setting up a lean into where if there's other animated movies, they are a part of James Gunn's world. But I would assume they'd be very small characters that James Gunn probably wouldn't be at least planning on touching in his universe anytime soon. So I don't know, if you've seen it and you've seen the ending, you might know what like the reference is there. And just like, they show one character at the end. They show, when we get into the new Earth, because obviously, I mean, it should be obvious we're going to see Prime Earth. We see one character, but it's a younger version of the character. But it's also sets it up to a point where, is that meant to be connecting to a certain TV show that's been planned? People have that theory. I don't think it's the case. I think it's just them sort of, showing us a bit of the Earth, but also not showing a developed Earth Prime in regards to what versions of characters or what a certain character looks like. But I don't know. I saw the theory there, and I think it's somewhat interesting. But yeah, overall, I think this was better than part two, but I think part one is still clearly the best part of this 3-part movie event. Maybe watching it back to back to back will be much better, but that's like 4.5 hours. Like, it's a long watch. It's a long watch to do it. But maybe it works better in that. I'm not too sure. You might have to trial it and let me know. But yeah, overall, I'd probably give the movie event like a 6. Might be, I don't know if that's me being like fair or being generous. I'm not too sure, but I feel like because one's like an 8.5, and then two's like a, I don't know, maybe even like a 6.5. I'm not too sure. I'd have to probably watch it all in one go to really give it a fair rating as a whole, but I'll sit on, you know what, I'll go 6.5. I'll go 6.5. Might be a 7. I'm not too sure, but I'm going to sit on 6.5. 6.5. Wasn't great. Wasn't insulting. Just a bit inconsistent and a bit drawn out. That's one of my biggest criticism. It just felt pretty drawn out. But yeah, guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, be awesome if you could drop a like and show support. Let me know in the comment section down below your various thoughts on this. If you've watched it, if you haven't, are you going to watch it? Do you have any reasons why? And do you agree with any of those things I was talking about in regards to theories, in regards to the end, and maybe it's meant to lead into James Gunn's thing? I don't know. Let me know. And of course, if you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you guys later. Goodbye.